Behind Ridley Scott's dystopian masterpiece lurks a treasure trove of bizarre production secrets, from Harrison Ford's deliberate sabotage attempts to a real python named Darling, and from Philip K. Dick's prophetic death, just months before release, to a white dove that became cinema's most mysterious symbol. Fact 1. Rutger Hauer wore pink pants to his first meeting. When Rutger Hauer first walked into his meeting with director Ridley Scott to discuss playing Roy Batty in Blade Runner, he wasn't dressed like the intimidating replicant leader audiences would come to know. Instead, the Dutch actor decided to pull an elaborate prank that left the renowned director completely stunned. Hauer showed up wearing the most outrageous outfit he could put together: enormous green sunglasses that looked like something Elton John might wear on stage, bright pink satin pants that caught the light, and a white sweater decorated with the image of a fox on the front. The whole ensemble was so unexpected and bizarre that when Scott first laid eyes on his potential Roy Batty, the director literally turned white with shock. According to production executive Katherine Haber, who witnessed the encounter, Scott's reaction was priceless. She later said she loved watching the look on Scott's face as he tried to process what he was seeing. Here was an actor he had already decided to cast based solely on his powerful performances in Dutch films like Turkish Delight, Soldier of Orange, and Katie Tipple. But Scott had never actually met Hauer in person before this moment. The prank was entirely Hauer's idea, and it perfectly captured his playful personality and his approach to getting into character. Despite the shocking first impression, or perhaps because of it, Scott and Hauer quickly bonded during their meeting. They discovered they both shared an interest in the French science fiction comic magazine Metal Hurlant, and Hauer impressed Scott with his thoughtful ideas about how Roy Batty should be portrayed. This unconventional first meeting set the tone for what would become one of cinema's most memorable villain performances. Hauer's willingness to take risks and surprise people, even before filming began, hinted at the creative energy he would bring to the role of the complex philosophical replicant leader. Fact 2. Harrison Ford sabotaged his own voiceover. Harrison Ford's hatred of the studio-imposed voiceover narration in Blade Runner led him to attempt one of Hollywood's most unusual acts of professional rebellion. When test audiences found the original version of the film too confusing, studio executives decided that Ford needed to record explanatory narration as his character, Rick Deckard, to help viewers follow the complex plot. Ford was completely against this decision because he believed the film worked perfectly well without someone telling the audience what they could already see happening on screen. He felt that adding a voiceover would undermine the visual storytelling that made Blade Runner so unique and would turn the sophisticated science fiction thriller into something much more ordinary and predictable. Rather than simply refusing to do the recording sessions, Ford came up with a clever plan to make the studio change their minds. He decided to deliver the most deliberately terrible, lifeless, and monotone performance he could manage, hoping that when the producers heard how awful it sounded, they would realize their mistake and abandon the voiceover idea entirely. Production executive Katherine Haber was present during the recording sessions and later confirmed that Ford's lackluster delivery was completely intentional. She watched as the normally talented actor gave a stilted, emotionless reading of lines that were meant to provide insight into Deckard's thoughts and feelings throughout the movie. Unfortunately for Ford, his plan backfired spectacularly. Instead of scrapping the narration, the studio executives decided to use his deliberately poor performance in the final version of the film. Ford later described the entire experience as a nightmare, explaining that he had originally been told the movie would be released without any voiceover, but then found himself forced to record narration for people who didn't represent the director's interests. The irony is that Ford's intentionally bad voiceover became one of the most criticized aspects of the original theatrical release, with many fans and critics noting how detached and uninterested he sounded throughout the film. Fact 3. The snake was Joanna Cassidy's real pet. The large python that wraps around actress Joanna Cassidy during her scenes as the replicant Zora wasn't a movie prop or a trained animal actor, but rather Cassidy's own beloved pet snake that she brought from home to the Blade Runner set. The 4-year-old male Burmese python was named Darling, and Cassidy had owned him long before she was cast in Ridley Scott's science fiction film. In the movie, Zora works as an exotic dancer at a seedy club called the Snake Pit, where she performs with what appears to be an artificial snake as part of her act. When Deckard questions her about whether the snake is real, Zora responds that she couldn't afford a real one if she's working at a place like that. But the irony is that the snake draped around Cassidy's neck throughout the scene was completely genuine. Cassidy was actually cast in the role partly because of her experience with snakes and her obvious comfort handling them. She had previously owned more than 6 snakes at one time and used to roller skate down the Venice boardwalk in California with one of them draped across her shoulders, so working with Darling on camera came naturally to her. However, the filming process wasn't entirely smooth for the python. The movie's elaborate set design included heavy use of smoke effects to create the dark, atmospheric look that Blade Runner is famous for, and all that artificial smoke in Zora's dressing room scenes made Darling increasingly uncomfortable and irritated as the day wore on. Cassidy later explained that the snake was getting annoyed by the constant smoke being pumped into the set, which was bothering his breathing and making him restless during takes. Despite these challenges, Darling performed like a professional throughout the filming, remaining calm enough around Cassidy's neck and shoulders that audiences watching the movie would never guess the snake was dealing with any discomfort from the production's special effects. Fact 4. Philip K. Dick died never seeing the finished film. Philip K. Dick, the science fiction author who wrote the novel Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep that Blade Runner was based on, tragically died on March 2, 1982, just 4 months before the movie reached theaters. This means that Dick never got to see how his complex story about artificial humans and the nature of consciousness was transformed into one of cinema's most influential science fiction films. However, Dick did get a tantalizing glimpse of what Ridley Scott was creating during the film's production. In December of 1981, Scott invited the author to a private screening where he showed him about 20 minutes of special effects footage that had been completed. The scenes Dick watched were mostly visual effects, shots with some sound effects, but no music, giving him a preview of the dark, rain-soaked Los Angeles that would become the movie's most memorable feature. Dick's reaction to what he saw was nothing short of amazement. After watching the footage, he turned to Scott and exclaimed, "How is this possible?" "The environment is exactly how I'd imagined it." This response was particularly remarkable because Scott later admitted that he had never actually read Dick's original novel while making the film, relying instead on the screenplay adaptations that had been written by other people. Dick was so impressed by the footage that he wrote an enthusiastic letter to the production company, praising what he had seen and predicting that Blade Runner would revolutionize people's understanding of what science fiction movies could achieve. He described the visual approach as potentially creating a unique new form of artistic expression that went beyond traditional filmmaking. The author's enthusiasm was a complete turnaround from his earlier skepticism about the project. Dick had initially been very critical of the first screenplay adaptation, comparing it unfavorably to other projects, but seeing Scott's visual realization of his imagined world completely changed his perspective on how the movie would turn out. Fact 5. The final scene was shot hours before studio takeover. The iconic rooftop confrontation between Rick Deckard and Roy Batty that serves as Blade Runner's climactic finale was filmed under extraordinary time pressure, with Ridley Scott racing against a studio-imposed deadline that would have stripped him of creative control. The producers had grown increasingly frustrated with Scott's meticulous directing style and the film's mounting production costs, so they set a specific date when they would take over the project and finish it themselves. Scott was determined to complete his vision for the movie's ending before losing control, which meant that the most important scene in the entire film had to be shot during the final hours before the studio's takeover was scheduled to begin. This intense time crunch created enormous pressure on everyone involved, from the actors to the crew members who were working to capture one of cinema's most memorable confrontations. The original script called for a very different kind of ending, with Deckard and Roy Batty engaging in a martial arts-style fight scene in an old gymnasium. However, Rutger Hauer felt that a Bruce Lee-inspired action sequence wouldn't fit with the thoughtful, philosophical tone that the rest of the movie had established, so he suggested that Roy should instead pursue Deckard through the building in a more psychological cat-and-mouse game. Scott agreed with Hauer's vision and incorporated this change into the final scene, but the clock was still ticking toward the moment when the producers would arrive to take control of the production. The crew worked frantically to capture all the shots they needed for the rooftop sequence, including Roy's famous final monologue about memories being lost like tears in rain. The fact that such a crucial and emotionally powerful scene was created under these desperate circumstances makes the final result even more remarkable. Scott managed to film everything he needed for his preferred ending just in time, preserving his artistic vision for what would become one of the most quoted and analyzed scenes in science fiction cinema. Fact 6. Dustin Hoffman was nearly cast as Deckard. Before Harrison Ford became the Blade Runner Rick Deckard, Ridley Scott had his heart set on casting Dustin Hoffman in the lead role, and the director spent several months trying to convince the Academy Award-winning actor to take on the project. At the time, Hoffman was fresh off his Best Actor Oscar win for Kramer vs. Kramer, and was known for playing sensitive, intellectual characters rather than traditional action heroes. Scott and producer Michael Dealey were specifically drawn to Hoffman because of his anti-macho image, believing that his unconventional approach to masculine roles would bring something unique to the character of Deckard. They envisioned a more thoughtful, cerebral version of the Blade Runner that would contrast with the typical tough guy protagonists found in most science fiction films of that era. The casting process involved extensive meetings between Scott and Hoffman, with the director spending hours and hours in discussions trying to persuade the actor to commit to the role. However, Hoffman had serious reservations about the project from the very beginning, and his concerns went beyond just the script or the character development. Hoffman's blunt response to Scott's pitch perfectly captured his confusion about why he was being considered for the part. He asked the director, "Why the hell do you want me to play this macho character?" This question revealed the fundamental disconnect between what Scott was hoping to achieve with the casting and how Hoffman saw himself as a performer. Producer Michael Dealey later explained that Hoffman's enthusiasm for the project, while initially promising, became problematic because the actor wanted to make significant changes to the script that would have fundamentally altered the story's direction. Hoffman's approach would have slowed down production considerably and transformed Blade Runner into a very different kind of movie. When Hoffman finally decided to pass on the role in October of 1980, it opened the door for Harrison Ford to step in and create the iconic version of Rick Deckard that audiences know today. Fact 7. The Tears in Rain speech was heavily improvised. The most famous monologue in Blade Runner, delivered by Rutger Hauer as Roy Batty dies in the rain, bears little resemblance to what screenwriter David Peoples originally wrote for that climactic moment. Hauer felt that the scripted version was far too long and overly technical, describing it as opera talk and high-tech speech that didn't match the emotional weight of a dying character's final words. The original screenplay contained a much longer speech that ran about half a page of dialogue, filled with detailed technical language about Roy's experiences in space battles and off-world adventures. Hauer believed this approach was completely wrong for the scene, arguing that a replicant, who was literally running out of power, wouldn't have time for an elaborate monologue about his memories. On the night before filming the death scene, Hauer took matters into his own hands and drastically rewrote the speech without telling Ridley Scott about his changes. He cut approximately 200 words from Peoples' original version, keeping only the lines about attack ships on fire off the shoulder of Orion and sea-beams glittering in the dark near the Tannhauser Gate, which he felt had genuine poetic quality. The most significant addition Hauer made was the speech's haunting final line about moments being lost in time like tears in rain. This phrase, which has become one of the most quoted lines in science fiction cinema, came entirely from Hauer's own imagination as he tried to capture what Roy Batty would want to express about the tragedy of his short existence. When Hauer delivered his revised version during filming, the emotional impact was immediate and powerful. Crew members who witnessed the performance reportedly began crying and applauding as soon as Scott called cut on the scene. Hauer later explained that he wanted Roy's final words to show Deckard what a real person was made of, creating a moment where the artificial being demonstrates more humanity than the humans hunting him. Fact 8. Stanley Kubrick donated footage for the happy ending. The sweeping helicopter shots of pristine countryside that appear in the original theatrical version of Blade Runner's ending weren't filmed by Ridley Scott or his crew, but were actually unused outtakes from Stanley Kubrick's horror masterpiece, The Shining. When studio executives decided they needed a more upbeat conclusion than Scott's ambiguous original ending, they found themselves needing footage of beautiful natural landscapes to show Deckard and Rachel driving away to safety. Rather than spending money to shoot new aerial footage, the studio made an unusual request directly to Kubrick, asking if they could use some of the helicopter shots he had captured for the opening sequence of The Shining. The famous director had filmed extensive aerial footage of cars driving through the mountains and forests around Glacier National Park in Montana. But only a small portion of that material had made it into his finished film. Kubrick's response to this request was surprisingly generous, especially considering that directors of his stature rarely involve themselves in other people's projects. However, Kubrick had been a genuine admirer of Scott's previous science fiction film Alien, and his respect for Scott's work made him willing to help with the completion of Blade Runner. The legendary director agreed to provide the footage with one important condition. The studio could only use shots that hadn't appeared in The Shining itself. Kubrick was protective of his own artistic vision and didn't want any of his actual film footage to be recycled in another movie, but he was perfectly happy to let them use the extra material that had been left on the cutting room floor. This collaboration between two of cinema's most influential directors resulted in one of the most unusual creative partnerships in film history, even though the two men never worked together directly. The irony is that Kubrick's beautiful sunlit footage was used to create an ending that Scott himself never wanted, serving as the backdrop for a conclusion that many fans consider completely at odds with the dark, pessimistic tone of the rest of Blade Runner. Fact 9. Harrison Ford got a haircut to avoid wearing hats. Harrison Ford's decision to get a contemporary haircut right before filming Blade Runner wasn't motivated by fashion or character development, but rather by his strong desire to avoid wearing any kind of hat or headwear during the production. Ford had just finished an exhausting shoot for Raiders of the Lost Ark, where his character, Indiana Jones, wore the iconic fedora in practically every single scene throughout the entire movie. The experience of constantly wearing that hat during the Raiders production had left Ford feeling tired of having headwear as part of his costume, and he was determined not to repeat that experience on his next film project. Ford knew that if he showed up to the Blade Runner set with longer hair that could be easily styled or hidden, there was a good chance that Ridley Scott or the costume designers might decide that Rick Deckard should wear some kind of hat as part of his Blade Runner look. To prevent this possibility from even coming up during costume discussions, Ford made a preemptive strike by visiting a barber and getting a distinctly modern, shorter haircut that would look completely wrong under any kind of period-appropriate or futuristic headwear. The haircut was specifically chosen to be contemporary and styled in a way that would make it obvious that covering it up with a hat would ruin the intended look. Ford's strategy worked perfectly, as the shorter, more modern hairstyle became an integral part of how Rick Deckard appeared throughout the film. The haircut helped establish Deckard as a character who belonged in the futuristic world of 2019 Los Angeles, while also ensuring that Ford could perform all of his scenes without having to deal with the practical difficulties and discomfort that come with wearing hats during long shooting days. This small act of rebellion against potential costume requirements shows how even seemingly minor decisions by actors can end up influencing the visual style and character design of major Hollywood productions. Fact 10. The white dove wasn't in the script. The white dove that Roy Batty holds in his hand during his famous death scene and releases as he dies wasn't part of the original screenplay for Blade Runner, but was instead a creative addition suggested by Rutger Hauer himself. This symbolic image has become one of the most memorable and discussed visual elements in the entire film, yet it came about through the actor's own interpretation of how his character should meet his end. Hauer felt that Roy Batty needed something more than just words to mark his transition from life to death, and he proposed the idea of holding a dove that would fly away at the moment of his passing. The actor believed this visual metaphor would help communicate the spiritual and philosophical themes that were central to Roy's character throughout the movie, particularly the question of whether artificial beings could possess souls. The dove imagery works on multiple symbolic levels that audiences have been analyzing for decades since the film's release. In Christian tradition, doves represent peace, the Holy Spirit, and the soul ascending to heaven, which creates a powerful visual connection to Roy's final act of mercy when he saves Deckard's life instead of letting him fall to his death from the rooftop. What makes the dove sequence particularly puzzling for many viewers is that the bird seems to appear out of nowhere during the scene. Unlike other props and visual elements in the movie that are carefully established and explained, the dove simply exists in Roy's hand without any prior setup or explanation of where it came from or why he would be carrying it. This mysterious quality has led to countless discussions among fans and film scholars about the dove's meaning and significance, with some interpreting it as a supernatural element that suggests Roy's transcendence, while others see it as a purely symbolic device that represents the release of his artificial soul. The fact that Hauer created this iconic moment through his own creative input rather than following a scripted direction makes it an even more remarkable example of how actors can contribute to a film's lasting artistic impact. Fact 11. Sean Young's dialogue was changed in post-production. One of the most important lines in Blade Runner was completely altered after filming was finished, changing the meaning of an entire scene through post-production editing. When Rick Deckard visits the Tyrell Corporation and asks Rachel whether the impressive owl perched nearby is artificial, actress Sean Young originally delivered the line, "Of course not," suggesting that the magnificent bird was real and living. However, Ridley Scott realized during the editing process that Young's original response worked against one of the film's central themes about the relationship between artificial and natural life. Scott wanted to establish early in the movie that Dr. Tyrrell's corporation had become so advanced in creating artificial creatures that their creations were virtually indistinguishable from real animals, making the question of what counts as authentic life much more complicated. Scott made the decision to change Rachel's response in post-production, dubbing over Young's original dialogue so that she instead says, "Of course it is," when asked about the owl's artificial nature. This single word change transformed the entire meaning of the exchange and helped set up the film's exploration of how difficult it can be to tell the difference between real and artificial beings. The change also serves as crucial foreshadowing for the later revelation that Rachel herself is a replicant, even though she doesn't initially know this fact about her own identity. By having her matter-of-factly acknowledge that Tyrrell creates perfect artificial animals, the scene plants the seed for audiences to question whether she might also be one of his artificial creations. What makes this dialogue change particularly interesting is that viewers can still see that Young's lip movements don't quite match the audio in the finished film, creating a subtle continuity error that reveals the post-production alteration. This technical imperfection actually survived through multiple versions and releases of the movie, serving as evidence of how Scott prioritized the thematic importance of the line over achieving perfect visual synchronization between the actress's mouth movements and the dubbed dialogue. Fact 12. The snake scale serial number was wrong. A crucial piece of detective work in Blade Runner contained a glaring continuity error that went unnoticed and unfixed for 25 years after the film's original release. When Rick Deckard brings the artificial snake scale he found in Leon's bathtub to the street vendor for identification, the serial number she reads out loud to him doesn't match the number that appears on her video screen during the same scene. This sequence is important to the movie's plot because the serial number allows Deckard to trace the artificial snake back to its manufacturer, which eventually leads him to discover that Zhora is working as an exotic dancer at the Snake Pit nightclub. The vendor examines the scale under her magnifying equipment and announces the serial number that identifies it as coming from a specific type of artificial snake. But sharp-eyed viewers noticed that her spoken words didn't correspond to what was displayed on her monitor. The mistake occurred during the complex process of filming and editing the scene, which involved multiple takes, close-up shots of the vendor's equipment, and careful coordination between the actress's dialogue and the visual effects showing the magnified scale and computer readouts. Somewhere in this process, the audio and visual elements became mismatched, creating a continuity error that made it into the theatrical release. What makes this error particularly notable is how long it persisted through different versions of the film. The mistake appeared in the original 1982 theatrical release, the 1992 director's cut, and several other versions that were released over the years, suggesting that either no one noticed the discrepancy or it wasn't considered important enough to fix during earlier restoration efforts. The error was finally corrected in 2007 when Ridley Scott had the opportunity to create Blade Runner, the final cut, which he intended to be the definitive version of his film. Scott and his team went through the movie frame by frame, fixing various technical issues and continuity problems that had accumulated over the years. The snake scale serial number mismatch was among the corrections they made to achieve their vision of a perfect version. Fact 13. The film bombed because of E.T. Blade Runner's poor box office performance during its initial release in 1982 wasn't due to lack of quality or audience interest in science fiction, but rather because it had the misfortune of competing directly against Steven Spielberg's E.T. the Extraterrestrial, which became a massive cultural phenomenon that overshadowed every other movie released that summer. The timing couldn't have been worse for Ridley Scott's dark, philosophical vision of the future, as audiences were flocking to theaters to see Spielberg's heartwarming story about a friendly alien who just wanted to phone home. E.T. offered hope, wonder, and emotional uplift that appealed to families and moviegoers of all ages, while Blade Runner presented a bleak, rain-soaked future filled with questions about identity, mortality, and what it means to be human. Making the situation even more unfortunate, Blade Runner wasn't the only sophisticated science fiction film to suffer from this timing problem. John Carpenter's The Thing, which is now considered another classic of the genre, was released on the exact same day as Blade Runner and experienced an equally disappointing box office performance for the same reasons. Both Blade Runner and The Thing dealt with darker themes that required audiences to think deeply about disturbing concepts, while E.T. provided the kind of feel-good entertainment that people preferred during the summer movie season. Word of mouth quickly spread that both films had depressing, challenging storylines that contrasted sharply with the optimistic tone that E.T. had established as the summer's dominant mood. The financial impact was significant, with Blade Runner earning only $41.5 million against its $30 million budget, making it a clear commercial disappointment, despite the critical praise it received from some reviewers. However, both Blade Runner and The Thing eventually found their audiences through home video releases and television broadcasts, proving that their initial box office failure was more about unfortunate timing than any lack of artistic merit or entertainment value. Fact 14. Harrison Ford and Sean Young's love scene was actually a hate scene. The romantic scene between Rick Deckard and Rachel in Blade Runner became infamous among the film's crew members, who nicknamed it the hate scene because of the genuine animosity between Harrison Ford and Sean Young that was visible even during their most intimate moments on camera. The two actors had developed such a strong dislike for each other during production that their personal conflict actually enhanced the complex, uncomfortable dynamics between their characters. Production executive Katherine Haber, who witnessed the filming of their romantic encounter, later described the scene as anything but loving, explaining that what audiences see on screen is real tension and hostility rather than passion or tenderness. The scene where Deckard forcefully pushes Rachel against the Venetian blinds was particularly intense because Ford's aggression toward Young was completely genuine rather than just good acting. According to Haber's account, Ford actually hurt Young during filming, and the pain and shock visible on Rachel's face in that moment was Sean Young's real reaction to being physically harmed by her co-star. The incident wasn't an isolated occurrence, as Young later revealed that Ford hurt her multiple times during the production, though she also mentioned that he would try to make up for these incidents by doing silly things like mooning her to get laughs and lighten the mood. The fractious relationship between the two actors created such a tense atmosphere on set that Ford and Young never developed any kind of professional chemistry or personal rapport throughout the entire filming process. Ridley Scott found himself in the position of having to talk Young through her performance in many scenes because the communication between his two lead actors had completely broken down. Despite their mutual dislike, or perhaps because of it, their scenes together carry an undercurrent of genuine conflict that actually serves the story well, as Deckard and Rachel's relationship in the film is meant to be complicated, uncomfortable, and morally ambiguous rather than traditionally romantic. Fact 15. The term replicant was invented by a screenwriter's daughter. The word replicant, that has become synonymous with Blade Runner and entered popular culture as a term for artificial humans, didn't actually exist in Philip K. Dick's original novel Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? In his book, Dick referred to these artificial beings simply as androids, or used the casual nickname Andes when characters talked about them in everyday conversation. Screenwriter David Webb Peoples realized during the adaptation process that these terms from the novel would sound awkward and potentially silly when spoken aloud by actors in dramatic scenes. He was concerned that having characters say androids or Andes throughout the movie would undermine the serious, philosophical tone that the film was trying to achieve, making the artificial beings seem less threatening and sophisticated than the story required. Peoples needed to come up with a new term that would sound more scientific and ominous while still being easy for actors to pronounce naturally in dialogue. Rather than struggling with this creative challenge alone, he turned to his daughter Risa for help, knowing that her educational background might provide the perfect solution. At the time, Risa Peoples was studying microbiology and biochemistry, giving her familiarity with scientific terminology and the way that technical terms are constructed in those fields. She suggested the word replicant, which drew on the scientific concept of replication, while sounding appropriately clinical and futuristic for the movie's setting. The term worked perfectly for the film's needs because it suggested both the process of copying or duplicating something and carried connotations of artificial reproduction that fit with the story's themes about what makes life authentic or meaningful. The word replicant also had a slightly sinister quality that made these artificial beings sound more dangerous and morally complex than simple androids would have. This family collaboration between Peoples and his daughter created one of science fiction's most enduring and influential terms, with replicant now being used in discussions about artificial intelligence, robotics, and the future of human-machine relationships far beyond the world of Blade Runner.